Hello my friends, welcome to another Science video. In this one we're going to be looking at the topic of respiration as part of biology paper 1 for GCSE AQA. We're going to look at what aerobic respiration is, what anaerobic respiration is in comparison without oxygen, how our body responds to exercise, and what metabolism is. Let's get to it. This is a topic which is part of the bioenergetics topic in paper 1 for AQA. We've got another video on photosynthesis as well as the other topics that are in this paper, and we're going to be covering these 4 points here. So what is respiration? Well, respiration is an exothermic chemical reaction. Exo means exiting and therm means energy, so it's letting energy out as a chemical reaction. So this is a reaction that's happening continuously in living cells, and every single living cell needs to get energy, and this is the process that they tend to use to get energy. And this supplies the energy needed for living processes, which are basically reactions. Living processes are either small reactions or long chains of reactions that work together. And the energy that comes from this is produced because we use either oxygen in aerobic respiration, or we don't use oxygen and we do something called anaerobic respiration. And we're going to look at what happens in anaerobic respiration in humans and mussels, as well as what happens in plants and yeast. But first we're going to focus on the main one, the aerobic respiration. Aerobic means that it is respiration using oxygen. And respiration always is going to start with the molecule of glucose, and this has come from our food. If you've looked at photosynthesis already, photosynthesis produces glucose. That's the process, and that's the key process for getting energy from sunlight. It produces glucose, and glucose is a sugar. It's a sugar with the chemical structure of C6H12O6. And we're burning it with oxygen, very controlled conditions, using a whole long chain reaction with lots of different types of enzyme working to give us energy. But this is the summary of the process. So glucose is reacted with oxygen, and it goes to make carbon dioxide and water. Now this really is the reverse of the photosynthesis equation. In photosynthesis we take CO2 and water and we react those two together with sunlight that goes in, and we get glucose and oxygen out. We're reversing this here, so we're putting glucose and oxygen together and we're getting out extra, if you like, energy. Energy is not a physical thing in this case, but it's being released as part of the reaction. And because it's coming out of the reaction, that's why we call it exothermic. Photosynthesis, on the other hand, is taking energy in, which is why it was called an endothermic reaction. But this one is very much exothermic. And so what we're trying to do here is release energy. And this process of aerobic respiration happens in a mitochondria. And the mitochondria are found in all of our cells, especially the ones that need to do more aerobic respiration, like those that might be in muscles or those that do a lot of active transport. And respiration is needed for many processes, pretty much all processes that happen in our body. So things like chemical reactions, it's used to make larger molecules, for example. It can be used as an energy source to break down molecules too. We use it to control movement. We use it to keep warm, and that's just a handful. These are the ones that you're given in the specification, but there are loads of different ways that we use energy in our bodies, and cells will use them to keep alive. And respiration is critical. So we've got this lovely topic here of bioenergetics, where we're looking at the use of energy in living things, hence bioenergetics. Photosynthesis takes sunlight and makes glucose. Respiration releases that energy from glucose. And please, please, please remember that respiration is not just happening in animals. Respiration happens in plants as well. So plants do photosynthesis to produce glucose, but then they need to get energy out of that glucose by using respiration. So in a plant cell, you have mitochondria as well as chloroplasts. So in anaerobic respiration, an is a prefix that's like a negative. So anaerobic means without oxygen or without air. So in this case, it's respiration that's happening in the absence of oxygen. And this might happen in high intensity exercise in animals. So if you're sprinting, if you're lifting weights, if you're doing your high intensity workout, Joe Wicks kind of style, that is all about high intensity, and you're going to be using anaerobic respiration, stressing those muscles so that they get fitter. Now, it's not to say that aerobic aerobic exercise is not good for you. It absolutely is, but it uses mechanisms in a slightly different way. Now, in microorganisms or in plants, it might happen where there are oxygen deprived locations. So for example, fermentation is a chemical process that we use to produce beer. It produces alcohol, and that's because of the respiration process that they use without oxygen. And it also happens in waterlogged soil. So plants in roots that have a really waterlogged area around them, they will struggle to get oxygen, and they will start using anaerobic respiration, which is not so good. So plants can also do this too. So this is really an emergency case of trying to get energy from glucose but without using oxygen. But because it's this emergency process and we're trying to do something called oxidation of the glucose without oxygen, you can't do oxidation very well. So we call it incomplete. It's not complete oxidation of glucose. So we're not getting as much energy as the version that actually uses oxygen. So we're getting much less energy with anaerobic respiration than we do with aerobic respiration. And the equation looks like this. So glucose goes to make lactic acid. There's nothing else involved. We're just turning glucose into something else. There's no byproduct of carbon dioxide or water here for humans. This is very much in humans and animals. We're not putting oxygen in. It's anaerobic conditions. So we don't use that very well. In fact, lactic acid is pretty toxic for our muscles, and it can be pretty uncomfortable if you build up too much of it, and it can stop your muscles from working. In plant and yeast cells, they can oxidize the glucose a little bit more. So they produce the lactic acid and then they take it an extra stage, and they actually turn glucose into ethanol, which is found in alcohol. They also produce carbon dioxide, CO2. Now, the only molecules that you need to know the symbols of here are glucose, which is C6H12O6, and the carbon dioxide. You don't need to know the structures of lactic acid and ethanol. But because they produce ethanol and they produce carbon dioxide, this process is what we encourage to happen when we're making bread. We want the bubbles from the CO2 to make nice airy loaves of bread, and we want the ethanol to be found in alcohol when we do fermentation for making beer and wine and that sort of thing. So it's a very useful process. And as I say, this anaerobic respiration is not as efficient at delivering energy as aerobic respiration is, and you might get asked to compare the two processes together. But anaerobic respiration does not happen in mitochondria. It doesn't produce as much energy. It doesn't use oxygen. Aerobic respiration does use oxygen, produces more energy, tends to happen in mitochondria. In this part, we're going to look at how we respond to exercise. So we only need to know about animals here and humans. We know that we cannot anaerobically respire for long. So this is when you're doing your sprints, you're doing lifting of weights, you're doing high intensity exercise, when you're not able to deliver enough oxygen to your muscle cells. And what this leads to is the buildup of this lactic acid. And the lactic acid buildup will lead to two things. Firstly, it's something called muscle fatigue, and eventually it will cause the muscles to be able to stop contracting efficiently. And that's when you really start to feel it hurting. Like, you know, if you've been sprinting for a long time, you just know that you can't do it any longer. It becomes a bit of a mental battle, and then you just have to stop. And this buildup of lactic acid leads to something called an oxygen debt. And this oxygen debt really is as it sounds. You're going to owe your body a debt to repay and get more oxygen back, which is why when you stop exercising, you end up kind of breathless and trying to get your breath back. And only when you kind of have got your breath back is the oxygen debt really gone. So when we are exercising, we need to try and get more oxygen to our muscles, because our muscles are trying to do as much aerobic respiration as possible. The more aerobic respiration we can do, the longer they will be able to work for. And so to do that, our body will increase its heart rate, its breathing rate, and its breathing volume. So your heart will be working faster, pumping more blood around your body more quickly. Your breathing rate will increase, getting more oxygen into your lungs, and you'll also be breathing deeper. So the lungs will actually expand to a larger point, getting more air into the lungs with every breath too. And all of those are trying to increase the amount of oxygen getting to your muscles. And the circulation topic, we've got a lovely video on. Go and have a look at that to look at how the heart muscles work, how the pacemaker is set, and how the blood vessels allow blood to be delivered around the body. If you're doing higher tier, we need to know about how lactic acid is really removed from our body. So how does this oxygen debt actually accumulate and how do we handle it? Well, lactic acid can be transported in our blood, and lactic acid is acidic. It's not good to have around, so we do need to get rid of it. And so what we do is we put it into the blood from the muscle cells and we transport it to the liver. And the liver is a really important organ. And in the liver, this lactic acid is converted back into glucose. So we had glucose converted into lactic acid. We're now going to do the reverse of that. And to do this, we need to have oxygen. So we're going to add oxygen in to do the reverse process. So by producing lactic acid, by not developing or releasing energy very efficiently, we end up getting this oxygen debt. We need to get more oxygen in to convert the lactic acid back into glucose, and hence this oxygen debt, which is the extra oxygen required to get rid of the lactic acid. The final part of respiration that we need to have an understanding of is something called metabolism. And metabolism is just a word that we use in biology to describe the sum, the total, if you like, of all of the reactions in a cell or in a body. So these are all the chemical reactions that are happening. And respiration supplies the energy for these. Okay, these chemical reactions are controlled by enzymes, but we need energy for most of these reactions to happen. So we're supplying energy from respiration. Respiration is unlocking the energy from the glucose, the food that we've consumed, or that plants have produced through photosynthesis. And so metabolism is where we're kind of using that energy. It's these chemical reactions, and respiration actually is a reaction that's included in that term of metabolism, because respiration is a chemical reaction. We're taking energy out of a molecule, glucose. And so in respiration, we have a few different examples of reactions that you need to be able to describe, and these all actually have been covered in other topics, but this is the linking of them together. So you've covered these making of useful products in the digestion topic. So an example of metabolism would be turning glucose into its storage molecules, which are starch, glycogen, and cellulose. So these long chains of glucose linked together. Again, you've covered this in a digestion one, so revisit that topic if you're not confident with it. We also can convert glucose into glycerol and fatty acids. So the glucose, a chain of carbons, effectively can be turned into glycerol molecules and fatty acid molecules, which eventually can be stored as lipids. And glucose might not actually be the metabolism part that respiration is linked to, but it needs energy to be able to do that. And we can also use glucose and the energy from respiration to bond glucose and nitrates together to make amino acids. So amino acids you would have definitely come across in digestion. You might not have come across the nitrates part there, but nitrates are for the nitrogen part of an amino acid. So amino acids have nitrogen in them and they have to come from nitrates. So we combine glucose and nitrates together. That makes amino acids, and lots of amino acids in a chain make proteins. And the final thing that we might use energy in from respiration in metabolism is in making of waste products. So proteins can't be stored in our body. We use them and then we break them down and have to get rid of them. And if we break them down, they form eventually something called urea. And you'll come across this more in paper 2 when you look at homeostasis and the production of waste in the body. So these are just examples of reactions of metabolism. The kind of question you might get asked is just to give an example of one. So I would straight away go respiration, and then I would maybe talk about some of these molecules that we are producing. So using glucose to produce starch, using glucose and energy to be converted into glycerol and fatty acids to make lipids. You get the idea. But that's our overview of respiration. If you have any questions or queries about any of it, do pop them in the comments below. Otherwise, like and subscribe, hit the bell. Check out any future videos that come out, and do look at the rest of the videos on this paper, especially for photosynthesis, because it really is just the reverse of respiration.